phosphate, a variety of different phosphates. This was the area I got involved in a few years ago. Joined the USGS in a study that was led by Paul Emsbo at the Central Minerals Group in Denver, where we wanted to do a pilot project on looking at rare earth elements and phosphate. We knew from the literature that especially marine phosphorites, this rock phosphate had, in some cases, elevated levels of rare earths. And so we did a kind of national scale pilot study. Let's see, how do we get there? Oh, I'm sorry. We're good. National scale pilot study where we looked at everything from Paleoproterozoic to Pliocene, all the way from Florida to California up to the UP of Michigan. So in all, we looked at about 23 different phosphate horizons. I was brought on, had a long interest in unusual rocks, ironstones, phosphorites, etc. My background's more in sequence stratigraphy, historical geology mapping. And so I was brought on to do the best job, I thought, was to run around and collect the rocks and sort out the stratigraphic context. And so did a lot of great work on that project, looking especially at some of the major phosphate deposits in the country. Again, Florida, Permian phosphoria out west, a lot of Ordovician in the mid-continent. And what we found was that there were some long-term secular trends, these rare earth plots where you have rare earths across the bottom, and then these are all normalized to North American shale composite. So basically we're seeing in the oldest phosphorites we looked at in the Paleoproterozoic, the very lowest concentrations actually, and we saw an increase in concentrations going into the upper Devonian. Also some really high concentrations in the upper Mississippian, and then a general kind of decrease. When you compare this rare earth enrichment to kind of traditionally mined rare earth deposits, some of these are really high, and I'll get into a little bit of that going forward. Got to go down to Florida and look at the primary phosphate deposit in the country. This is in the Hawthorne group, which is Miocene Pliocene age. This is what we might call a pebble phosphorite. It's anywhere from just a few inches to meters thick. Originally, they mined the Bone Valley member, which was a kind of channel form deposit that had a mix of marine and terrestrial derived phosphate, and it was about 30% phosphate. So it was a highly enriched deposit, and that's kind of what got the mining industry going there outside of Tampa. Today, Florida still produces about 85% of US phosphate. This is used in fertilizer production, but the good old days of high concentrations of phosphate are gone from Florida now. Now they're mining rocks that are about 3% phosphate. So these are in carbonates. These are shallow marine carbonates with a kind of a diffuse granular phosphate. But because of the high contrast and density between this kind of weakly cemented carbonate and the phosphate, they can quickly and inexpensively beneficiate that back up to about 30% phosphate, excuse me. And the phosphate's easy to digest. This is the mineral's francolite. It dissolves readily in weak acid. It's cheap production. The fertilizer industry, mines massive amounts of phosphate annually to put into production for cheap fertilizer. In our study, we found that this Miocene Pliocene phosphate had typically around 900 ppm total REEs. And when you do the calculations of how much phosphate they're digesting each year, and our study showed that even with these weak acids, just about 100% of the rare earths are going into solution. When you do the calculations, about 50% of the global demand, especially of heavy rare earths, is being put into solution annually, and it's going into the fertilizer. So this amazing bounty of rare earths is just being spread on our agricultural fields. Now, since we let that little secret out of the bag, there has been some activity in Florida to look at the concentration of the rare earths from the brines, from the rock, and even other byproducts of the phosphate fertilizer production. And they're seeing that these are readily extractable at varying levels of success based on which elements you're looking at. So fast forward a couple of years, USGS with American Association of State Geologists moves forward the Earth Mapping Resources Initiative, which has got a huge boost recently from the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So big push on rare earths in the initial part of this project. Of course, this plot just shows that China dominates the market as it does in most mining commodities. In the US, we used to be a major producer of rare earths, primarily from the Mountain Pass mine in California. This is a carbonatite, and if we go back, to this plot from our paper, you see that for Mountain Pass here in blue, it's super enriched in the light rare earths and relatively depleted in the heavies. So heavies are in large demand for a number of technologies. What has a more even distribution and higher heavy rare earths is the Bocan Mountain prospect in Alaska, which USGS has put a lot of efforts into characterizing. What you see is that our samples from the Upper Devonian are well above those concentrations in Bocan Mountain and certainly above other, for instance, the largest source of rare earths today is from the China clays, which are absorption type clay deposit, easily processed, but with very low rare earth concentrations. So one here would be your typical weathered product from continental crust, a shale, basically. So they're little enriched, but they're easily processed. Thus the economics, if you don't mind environmental destruction. Also we had upper Ordovician phosphorites also with relatively high enrichment, similar to Bocan Mountain. And then down here you see where the Florida phosphate deposits land. Okay, so based on those results early on in Earth MRI, especially with an emphasis on rare earths, this Upper Devonian interval for looking at rare earth enrichment was emphasized. Put forward a proposal, and it was funded right in the middle of COVID shutdown, so it's really hard to initiate. But basically, it had two spatial components: the Appalachian Basin outcrop area you see here in red, a lot of Devonian rock in the subsurface, and then the mid-continent, basically Illinois Basin and out to Oklahoma. And again, this was to look at, and this is a geochemical reconnaissance study. So the idea was get out, get into your core facilities, get into the field, collect as much Devonian and associated phosphate, if it happens to go up in the Mississippian, not a big deal. Collect that phosphate and let's get it into the lab and look at the numbers so we can start to build a knowledge base about this really little known resource. So we went out to the Appalachians, got a lot of really cool samples, different types of phosphate, pebble phosphorites, granular bone bed type phosphorites, some with really high concentrations, some associated with carbonates, some associated with black shales. In the Appalachians, it turns out most of the phosphate that's out there is in the lower Devonian. So, and that's an example of that there. There are also some really great museum collections because there tends to be a lot of bone and other things associated with these phosphorites. And so we were able to tap into some of those. And again, some really nice perspective results from some of those phosphorites there in the museum collections. Moving over into Kentucky, we're starting to see phosphates show up in the Middle Devonian, not so much Lower Devonian preserve there. And then into Tennessee, really the largest phosphorite in the region is called the Blue Rock phosphorite. So this was actually evaluated as a phosphate resource in Western Tennessee. It's up to a couple meters thick. It's highly variable. It's a granular phosphorite, so it's quite sandy. Lots of different types of phosphate in there. Whole rock values are around 10 times background, and it is sitting right at the Fronian-Fumenian stage boundary. Move up into the uppermost Devonian and into the lowermost Mississippian, and you get into this interval of concretionary phosphate that we see here in Oklahoma as well. A lot of concentrically laminated concretions at this interval. They're variable in terms of their concentration and size. They're typically associated with black shale, but they can be reworked into unconformity horizons. For instance, here in Western Tennessee, you get the Mississippian Fort Payne with a lag of reworked phosphate concretions and bone and all kinds of goodies in there. In this case, it's sitting right on the Ordovician. And a kind of a mix of components in those types of beds where you're kind of concentrating multiple horizons. Same horizons in Kentucky and Indiana, with some pretty prospective concentrations up to about 40 times background, and then again some preliminary results from Oklahoma for the similar horizons. And then, of course, Illinois. There we go. There's my shout out to Illinois. So regionally, in the eastern U.S., what we're finding is that the main phosphate horizons are associated with the Fronian-Fumenian boundary, stage boundary, and the Devonian Mississippian stage boundary. There's certainly more work to be done. There's a lot of nuance there in the details. How exactly are they related? But at this point in the study, it's really interesting. The Fronian-Fumenian, of course, is the interval for the second large, or one of the top 5 mass extinctions in Earth history. It's associated with 2 globally demonstrated oceanic anoxic events. For instance, here in Germany, you're in these deep marine red beds, and there are these 2 black horizons that mark the the upper and lower Kaltwasser horizons of the extinction. And then again, at the top of the Devonian, you have the Hagenberg event, second largest extinction in the Devonian, widespread black shales, picture of exposure in Poland. And so we like that model. It's really, we're looking for, so to back up, Earth MRI really is an academic study, right? It's an opportunity to increase our understanding of the kind of geologic framework of potential critical mineral resources, right? Provide that foundation for the private sector, other studies to be done to go in and really look at the details and the economics. So one of the things we saw in our pilot study was this potentially kind of secular change in rare earth enrichment in the phosphates. And with our new data from the Devonian, we have a chance to go in and look at some more of the details at a finer scale. And so in the lower Devonian, we see this kind of middle rare earth enrichment. And as we go up through the Devonian, that kind of hangs in. We're moving up through the lower Devonian. Again, middle rare earth enrichment is really a kind of constant signal. And then we get up into the Eifelian, and this is This is near the base of the Marcellus. So in the Appalachian Basin, there's really widespread kind of granular phosphorite bone bed horizon at this level. And we see this really pronounced negative cerium anomaly, which is really indicative of highly reducing conditions at the time of formation or deposition, and a broader rare earth pattern, relatively more heavy rare earths. And then as we move up through into the Middle Devonian, we're seeing that more centrally peaked pattern until we get to the Ferronian-Furmenian boundary, and then we see it broadening out again. And that pattern kind of persists through the, through the Upper Devonian into the Lower Mississippian. So that's where we're at right now with this very large, ambitious Devonian phosphate reconnaissance project. If that's not enough, we've also got a project on the Ordovician now. And now this is a little bit more spatially constrained. Our Ordovician phosphate project, again through Earth MRI, extends from Indiana over to Minnesota, down through Missouri and Illinois, Wisconsin. The Ordovician, this is what a bit of Ordovician phosphate looks like. If you like sedimentology, they're really great things to study. Really complex, kind of granular, oolitic phosphate. Where there are a lot of phosphate horizons in the Ordovician, it's incredibly rich in phosphate. A lot of different horizons. Our thickest deposits are pushing 10 meters, so they're really the thickest phosphorites we have outside of like the phosphoria, permanent phosphoria in parts of Idaho and Wyoming. We're really doing a lot of work on the geologic framework here. We have a lot of great cores through this interval in Illinois and Iowa in particular. We have some PhD students involved in refining some of the biostratigraphy. And a lot of great exposures. So this is what we call the Graph phosphorite for a section in outside of Dubuque in Graph, Iowa. Here the phosphorite interval is about 5 meters thick. It's a well-known locality actually because it's abundantly fossiliferous. It's a really weird fossil assemblage. It's dominated by small orthocone cephalopods, straight shell cephalopods by the millions. Three-dimensionally preserved graptolites. So it's mostly a deep water fauna. It is black shale associated. So for contrast with like the Florida phosphate deposits, it's more like the Upper Devonian in that it tends to be more black shale associated. And we've done some elemental mapping on the phosphorite to just get a better handle on the amount of impurities, the different minerals involved, et cetera. The concentrations on this one are really pretty similar to what we see in Florida. You know, you're somewhere in the 5 to 10 times background. Again, close up at some of the really interesting variety and textures. They're really, you know, really complex, which is exciting for sedimentologists. Just to give you a sense of just how big these things are in terms of rare earth resources. This one quarry just on the southwest side of Dubuque is about 1.5 kilometers wide and by about another 0.5 kilometer. The phosphorite there's about 5 meters thick. And just in this one quarry, the amount of material, that they've scraped off and kind of dumped in the back of the quarry is about half of the heavy rare earths contained in all of the Bocan Mountain prospect, which is a carbonatite type deposit in Alaska that is kind of the class of rare earth resources, kind of considered one of the best. So these are huge. This is just a tiny postage stamp in the full area for which this phosphorite occurs, and it's not even at a locality where it's at its thickest. And again, this is a relatively low grade phosphorite in terms of rare earth enrichment. Much more exciting is what we call the Love Hollow phosphorite. So this is, again, an upper Ordovician phosphate deposit. This is over in Arkansas, right next door. Over there, it tends to be a couple meters thick, but it's known to be up to about 9 meters thick locally. Again, really complex textures, and it does vary from being really kind of pure phosphate to more iron rich. There's a lot of microbial structure in these rocks, a lot of microbial process, a lot of reworking. Even at the kind of the hand sample scale, you can see a lot of nice kind of stromatolite structures. There is an association with paleokarst with both of the Ordovician deposits. So here at the Love Hollow quarry, so this is in the Batesville manganese district, you might be familiar with, in eastern Arkansas, kind of on the southern edge of the Ozark Dome. Here, again, phosphate's scraped off. What's with these people? They scrape off the best stuff just to expose the carbonates, But they've scraped off a fair bit of the phosphate and exposed the contact between the phosphate and the carbonates, which show a lot of really great paleokarst geomorphology, a lot of brikes, a lot of solution pitting that's then encrusted by the phosphate. Again, the kind of turn of the century, rock phosphate was really on the minds of U.S. geologists. A lot of the resource assessment for phosphate for rock fertilizer happened in the 1890s to 1910s. A lot of the phosphate in Tennessee and Arkansas, Florida was all mapped at that time. And looking at those resource assessments, you can get a pretty good sense of what the potential endowment is of this phosphate in the Batesville manganese district. It's substantial. It's many times. It blows away any other known resources for rare earths. That's my scientific interpretation. It blows it away. So again, the geology around these things, though, I mean, especially for a stratigrapher, it's really complex. A lot of unconformities, a lot of cross-cutting relations, a lot of seeming relationship to paleotopography, which is, if you ever tried to do that kind of work, is really, really tricky, right? Trying to figure out the elevation of something at the time of deposition. So, but one thing that we see consistently is that there are a number of unconformities associated with phosphate deposits. Paleokarst, especially in some of these units, is really widespread. And just to bring it back to Oklahoma and make the connection with Illinois for a minute, this is the Fernvale limestone. It's named for a locality in Tennessee. It's kind of, for anybody who's ever worked on Ordovician, it's pretty well known marker horizon. It's really easy to trace. It's enriched in iron, which makes it easy to find. So it's always this kind of pink to kind of golden color. It's widespread here in Oklahoma. Amsden decided to change the name to Welling at one point, but it's the same rock. It's the Fernvale. And I was just looking at cores of it yesterday. It's a really interesting rock, and it's full of paleokarst. Like I said, in the Batesville manganese district, that paleokarst is infilled and on-lapped by the Love Hollow phosphorite. In Illinois, there's another unit that occurs above it that's mostly shale dominated, and that's age equivalent to the Sylvan Shale. So extrapolating back down to Oklahoma, there is some complexity there because we think we know where the equivalent horizon of the Love Hollow phosphorite is, and it's well above the Sylvan Shale. So I think as time goes on and we learn more about this interval in Oklahoma, it's going to be really critical to to understand the relations between thinning of the sylvan, especially as you head over toward the Ozarks, and the relationship between where the fern veil is and what's sitting on top was never really a target before, but it's quite possible that the Love Hollow phosphorite sitting over there on the western edge of the Ozark Dome in eastern Oklahoma. So just to wrap up, we've done a lot of work. We've covered a lot of area over the last couple of years with this Devonian rare earth project funded by Earth MRI. We've inventoried hundreds of cores and outcrops. We've got hundreds of new analyses, new results of phosphate samples. We have been able to document some more fine scale secular changes in rare earth concentration and pattern. But there's still a lot of work to do, especially to kind of improve our abilities to predict where we're going to find thicks in the phosphate in the Devonian. And it's a jewel, because that's where the really high concentrations occur, as I was showing, over 100 times background. For the Ordovician, we're just kind of getting started, really. My funding for it just came through. So we're still just trying to ramp up the project. It's something personally I've been involved in for a long time. So we had a lot of samples on hand that helped us really kind of get up and moving quickly. We still, again, there's this work ongoing about the thicks and how to understand the relationship to spatial distributions between the phosphate bearing horizons, where we're going to find the thicks and where we're going to have pinch out. And with that, thank you for your time.